Good afternoon, happy Sunday. I hope everyone's doing well on this Easter Sunday if you celebrate. If not, I hope you're doing well anyway. We will be continuing with The Plague Ship by Norton. I think we're only going to get maybe one or two more sessions out of this book after today. It's not a ton left, and I'm very excited to see where we're going. So thank you for joining me as we continue our journey through space. Chapter 11, Desperate Measures. Measured in distance and time, that rough walk in the ponderous suits across the broken terrain of the asteroid was a short one, measured by the beating of his own heart. Dane thought it much too long. There was no sign of life by the airlock of the bubble, no move on the part of the men stationed there to come to their assistance. "Do you suppose we're invisible?" Ollie's disembodied voice clicked in the helmet earphones. "Maybe we'll wish we were." Dane could not forgo that return. Rip was almost to the airlock door now. His massively suited arm was outstretched toward the control bar when the comm unit in all three helmets caught the same demand. "Identify!" The crisp order had enough snap to warn them that an answer was the best policy. "Shannon, AA of the Polestar." Rip gave the required information. "We claim E-rights." But would they get them? Dane wondered. There was a loud click in his ears. The metal door was yielding to Rip's hand. At least those on the inside had taken off the lock. Dane quickened pace to join his leader. Together, the three from the Queen crowded through the locked door, saw that swing shut and seal behind them as they stood waiting for the moment they could discard the suits and enter the dome. The odds against them could not be too high. This was a small stat. It would not house more than 4 agents at the most, and they were familiar enough with the basic architecture of such stations to know just what move to make. Ali was to go to the comm room where he could take over if they did meet with any trouble. Dane and Rip would have to handle any dissenters in the main section, but they still hoped that luck might ride their fins and they could put over a story which would keep them out of active conflict with the Ices. The gauge on the wall registered safety, and they unfastened the protective clasps of the suits. Standing the cumbersome things against the wall as the inner door to the lock rolled back, they walked into icy territory. As free traders, they had the advantage of being uniformly tunicked, with no company badge to betray their ship or status, so that could well be the Polestat standing needle-slim behind them, and not the notorious Solar Queen. But each, as he passed through the inner lock, gave a hitch to his belt which brought the butt of his sleep rod closer to hand. Innocuous as that weapon was, in close quarters its effects, if only temporary, was to some purpose. And since they were prepared for trouble, they might have a slight edge over the Ices in attack. A company man, his tunic shabby and open in a negligent fashion at his thick throat, stood waiting for them. His unhelmeted head was grizzled, his coarse, tanned face with heavy jowls, bristly enough to suggest he had not bothered to use smooth cream for some days. An under-officer of some spacer, retired to finish out the few years before pension in this nominal duty, fast letting down the standards of personal regime he had had to maintain on shipboard. But he wasn't all fat and soft-living. The glance with which he measured them was shrewdly appraising. "What's your trouble?" he demanded without greeting. "You did an ident coming in." "Comms are out," Rip replied as shortly. "We need E-hydro." "First time I ever heard it that the comms were wired in with the grass." The Icy's hands were on his hips, in close proximity to something which made Dane's eyes narrow. The fellow was wearing a flare blaster. That might be regulation equipment for an E-stat agent on a lonely asteroid, but he didn't quite believe it. And probably the other was quick on the draw, too. "The comms are something else," Rip answered readily. "Our tech is working on them, but the hydro's bad although. We'll have to dump and restock. Give you a voucher on Terra for the stuff." The Icy agent continued to block the doorway into the station. "This is private IS property. You should hit the patrol post. They cater to you FTs." We hit the nearest east out when we discovered that we were contaminated. Rip spoke with an assumption of patience. That's the law, and you know it. You have to supply us and take a voucher. How do I know that your voucher is worth the film it's recorded on? Asked the agent reasonably. All right, Rip shrugged. If we have to do it the hard way, we'll cargo dump to cover your bill. Not on this field. The other shook his head. I'll flash in your voucher first. He had them, Dane thought bitterly. Their luck had run out because what was he going to do? What he was going to do was a move they dared not protest. It was one any canny agent would make in the present situation, and if they were what they said they were, they must readily agree to let him flash their voucher of payment to IS headquarters to be checked and okayed before they took the hydro stock. But Rip merely registered a mild resignation. You the Comtech? Where's your unit? I'll end it at once if you want it that way. Whether their readiness to cooperate allayed some of the agent's suspicion or not, he relaxed some, giving them one more stare all around before he turned on his heel. This way. They followed him down the narrow hall, Rip on his heels, the others behind. Lonely post, Rip commented. I'd think you boys'd get a space whirly out here. The other snorted. We're not star lovers, and the pay's worth a 3-month stretch. They take us down for terror leave before we start talking to the Whisperers. How many of you here at a time? Rip edged the question in casually. But the other might have been expecting it by the way he avoided giving a direct answer. Enough to run the place, and not enough to help you clean out your wagon. He was short about it. Any dumping you do is strictly on your own. You've enough hands on a spacer that size to manage. Rip laughed. Far be it from me to ask an icy to do any real work, was his counter. We know all about you company men. But the agent did not take fire at the jib. Instead, he pushed back a panel, and they were looking into a comm-unit room where another man in the tunic of the IS lounged on what was, by law, 24-hour duty divided into 3 watches. These FTs want to flash a voucher request through, their guide informed the tech. The other, interested, gave them a searching once-over before he pushed a small scriber toward Rip. It's all yours. Clear ether, he reported. Ali stood with his back to the wall, and Dane still lingered in the portal. Both of them fixed their attention on Rip's left hand. If he gave the agreed-upon signal. Their fingers were linked, loosely in their belts, only an inch or so from their sleep rods. With his right hand, Rip scooped up the scribbler while the Comtech half-turned to make adjustments to the controls, picking up a speaker to call the IS headquarters. Rip's left index finger snapped across his thumb to form a circle. Ali's rod did not even leave his belt. It tilted up, and the invisible, deadening stream from it centered upon the seated tech. At the same instant, Dane shot at the agent who had guided them there. The latter had time for a surprised grunt, and his hand was at his blaster as he sagged to his knees and then relaxed on the floor. The tech slumped across the callboard as if sleep had overtaken him at his post. Rip crossed the room and snapped off the switch which opened the wire for broadcasting, while Ali, with Dane's help, quietly and effectively immobilized the ICs with their own belts. There should be at least 3 men here, Rip waited by the door. We have to get them all under control before we start work. However, the interior of the bubble, extending as it did on levels beneath the outer crust of the asteroid, was not an easy place to search. An enemy, warned of the invasion, could easily keep ahead of the party from the Queen, spying on them at his leisure or preparing traps for them. In the end, afraid of wasting time, they contented themselves with locking the doors of the corridor leading to the lower levels, making ready to raid the storeroom they had discovered during their search. Emergency hydro supplies consisted mainly of algae, which could be stored in tanks and hastily put to use, as the plants now in the Queen took much longer to grow even under forcing methods. Dane volunteered to remain inside the E-Stat and assemble the necessary containers at the airlock, while the other 2, having had more experience, went back to the spacer to strip the hydro and prepare the switch contents. But when Rip and Ali left, the younger cargo apprentice began to find the bubble a haunted place. He took the sealed containers out of their storage racks, stood them on a small hand truck, and pushed them to the foot of the stairs, up which he then climbed, carrying 2 of the cylinders at a time. The swish of the air current through the narrow corridors made a constant murmur of sound, but he found himself listening for something else. For a footfall other than his own, for the betraying rasp of clothing against a wall, for even a whisper of a voice. Time and time again he paused, suddenly, to listen, sure that the faintest hint of such a sound had reached his ears. He had a dozen containers lined up when the welcome signal reached him by the comm unit of his field helmet. To transfer the cylinders to the lock, get out, and then open the outer door did not take long, but as he waited, he still listened for a sound which did not come. The notice that someone besides himself was free to move about the stat. Not knowing just how many of the supply tins were needed, he worked on transferring all there were in the storage racks to the upper corridor and the lock, but he still had half a dozen left to pass through when Rip sent a message that he was coming in. Out of his high-pressure suit, the astrogator apprentice stepped lightly into the corridor, looked at the array of containers, and shook his head. "We don't need all those. No, leave them," he added as Dane with a sigh started to pick up 2 for a return trip. "There's something more important just now." He turned into the side hall which led to the comm room. Both the IS men had awakened. The comm-tech appeared to accept his bonds philosophically. He was quiet and flat on his back, staring pensively at the ceiling. But the other agent had made a worm's progress half across the room, and Rip had to halt in haste to prevent stepping on him. Shannon stooped, and hooking his fingers in the other's tunic, heaved him back while the helpless man favored them with some of the ripest speech, and not trade lingo, Dane had ever heard. Rip waited until the man began to run down, and then he broke in with his pleasant soft drawl. "Oh, sure, we're all that, but time runs on, I see, and I'd like a couple of answers which may mean something to you. First, when do you expect your relief?" That set the agent off again, and his remarks, edited, were that no something-something FT was going to get any something-something information out of him. But it was his companion in misfortune, the comm-tech, who guessed the reason behind Rip's question. "Cut jets," he advised the other. "They're just being soft-hearted, I take it." He spoke over the other agent's sputtering to Rip. "That you're worried about leaving us finned down, that's it, isn't it?" Rip nodded. "In spite of what you think about us," he replied, "we're not patrol-posted outlaws." "No, you're just from a plague ship," the comm-tech remarked so calmly, and his words struck his comrade dumb. "Solar Queen?" "You got the warn off, then?" "Who didn't? You really have a plague on board?" The thought did not appear to alarm the comm-tech unduly, but his fellow suddenly heaved his bound body some distance away from the free traders, and his face displayed mixed emotions, most of them fearful. "We have something probably supplied," Rip straightened. "Might pass along to your bosses that we know that. Now suppose you tell me about your relief. When is it due?" "Not until after we take off on the long orbit, if you leave us like this. On the other hand," the other added coolly, "I don't see how you can do otherwise. We've still got those." With his chin he pointed to the comm unit. "After a few alterations," Rip amended. The bulk of the comm was in a tightly sealed case which they would need a flamer to open, but he could and did wreak havoc with the exposed portions. The tech watching this destruction spouted at least 2 expressions his companion had not used, but when Rip finished he was his unruffled self again. "Now," Rip drew his sleep rod, "a little rest, and when you wake it will all be a bad dream." He carefully beamed each man into slumber and helped Dane strip off their bonds, but before he left the room he placed on the recorder the voucher for the supplies they had taken. The Queen was not stealing. Under the law, she still had some shadow of rights. Suited, they crossed the rough rock to the ship, and there about the fins, already frozen into brittle spikes, was a tangle of plants, the rich result of years of collecting. "Did you find anything?" Dane asked as they rounded that mess on their way to the ladder. Rip's voice came back through the helmet room. "Nothing we know how to interpret. I wish Frank or Craig had had a chance to check. We took trides of everything before we dumped. Maybe they can learn something from these when—" His voice trailed off, leaving that "when" to ring in both of their minds. It was such an important when. When would either the steward or the medic recover enough to view those tri-D shots? Or was that when really an ominous, if. Back in the Queen, sealed once more for blastoff, they took their stations. Dane speculated as to the course Rip had set. Were they just going to wander about the system, hoping to escape notice until they had somehow solved their problem? Or did Shannon have some definite port in mind? He did not have time to ask before they lifted, but once they were spaceborne again, he voiced his question. Rip's face was serious. "Frankly," he began, and then hesitated for a long moment before he added, "I don't know. If we can only get the captain or Craig on their feet again—" "One thing," Ali materialized to join them. "Sinbad's back in the hydro, and this morning you couldn't get him inside the door. It's not a very good piece of evidence." No, it wasn't, but they clung to it as backing for their actions of the past few hours. The cat that had shown such a marked distaste for the company of the stricken and then for the hydro was now content to visit the latter as if some evil he had sensed there had been cleansed with the dumping of the garden. They had not yet solved their mystery, but another clue had come into their hands. But now the care of the sick occupied hours, and Rip insisted that a watch be maintained by the comm, listening in for news which might concern the Queen. They had done a good job at silencing the E-Stat, for they had been almost 6 hours in space before the news of their raid was beamed to the nearest patrol post. Ali laughed. "Told you we'd be pirates," he said when he listened to that account of their descent upon the IS station. "Though I didn't see all that blaster work they're now raving about, you'd think we fought a major battle there." Weeks growled. "The Ices are trying to make it look good, make us into outlaws." But Rip did not share in the general amusement at the wild extravagation of the report from the ether. "I noticed they didn't say anything about the voucher we left." Ali's cynical smile curled. "Did you expect them to? The Ices think they have us by the tail fins now. Why should they give us any benefit of the doubt? We junked all our boosters behind us on this takeoff, and don't forget that, my friends." Weeks looked confused. "But I thought you said we could do this legal." He appealed to Rip. "If we're patrol posted as outlaws—" "They can't do any more to us than they can for running in a plague ship," Ali pointed out. "Either will get us blasted if we happen into the wrong vector now, so what do?" "We find out what that plague really is," Dane said, and meant every word of it. "How?" Ali inquired. "Through some of Craig's magic?" Dane was forced to answer with the truth. "Well, I don't know yet, but it's our only chance." Rip rubbed his eyes wearily. "Don't think I'm disagreeing, but just where do we start? We've already combed Frank's quarters and Costy's. We've cleaned out the hydro. Those tri-D shots of the hydro, have you checked them yet?" Dane countered. Without a word, Ali rose and left the cabin. He came back with a microfilm roll. Fitting it into the large projector, he focused it on the wall and snapped the button. They were looking at the hydro. Down the length of space, so accurately recorded that it seemed they might walk straight into it. The greenery of the plants was so vivid and alive, Dane felt that he could reach out and pluck a leaf. Inch by inch he examined those ranks, looking for something which was not in order, had no right to be there. The long shot of the hydro, as it had been merged into a series of sectional groupings. In silence, they studied it intently, using all their field lore in an attempt to spot what each one was certain must be there somehow, but they were all handicapped by their lack of intimate knowledge of the garden. "Wait!" Weeks' voice scaled up. "Left-hand corner, there!" His pointing hand broke and shadowed the portion he was calling to their attention. Ali jumped to the projector and made a quick adjustment. Plants 4 and 5 times life-size glowed green on the wall. What Weeks had caught they all saw now. Ragged leaves. Stripped stems. "Chewed," Dane supplied the answer. It was only one species of plant which had been so mangled. Other varieties in the same bank showed no signs of disturbance, but all of that one type had at least one stripped branch, and 2 were virtual skeletons. "A pest," said Rip. "But Sinbad—" Dane began a protest before the memory of the cat's peculiar actions of the past week stopped him. Sinbad had slipped up. The hunter who had kept the Queen free of the ultra-alien life, which came aboard from time to time with cargo, had not attacked that which had ravaged the hydroplants, or, if he had done so, he had not, after his usual custom, presented the bodies of the slain to any crew member. It looks as if we have something at last, Ali observed, and someone echoed that with a sigh of heart-deep relief. Chapter 12. Strange Behavior of a Hoobat. All right, so we think we know a little more, Ali added a moment later. Just what are we going to do? We can't stay in space forever. There are the small items of fuel and supplies, and Rip had come to a decision. We're not going to remain spaceborne, he stated with the confidence of one who now saw an open road before him. Luna? Weeks was plainly doubtful. No, not after that worn-off. Terra. For a second or two, the other three stared at Rip agape. The audacity and danger of what he suggested was a little stunning. Since men had taken regularly to space, no ship had made a direct landing on their home planet. All had passed through the quarantine on Luna. It was not only risky, it was so unheard of that for some minutes they did not understand him. We try to set down at Terraport, Dane found his tongue first, and they flame us out. Rip was smiling. The trouble with you, he addressed them all, is that you think of Earth only in terms of Terraport. Well, there is the patrol field at Stella, Weeks agreed doubtfully, but we'd be right in the middle of trouble there. Did we have a regular port on Sargol? On Limbo? On 50 others I can name out of our log? Rip wanted to know. Ali voiced a new objection. So, we have the luck of Jones, and we set down somewhere out of sight. Then what do? We seal ship until we find the pest. Then we bring in a medic and get to the bottom of the whole thing. Rip's confidence was contagious. Dane almost believed that it could be done that way. Did you ever think, Ali cut in, what would happen if we were wrong? If the Queen really is a plague carrier? I said, we seal the ship. Tight, countered Shannon. And when we Earth, it'll be where we won't have visitors to infect, and that is where. Ali, who knew the deserts of Mars better than he did the greener planet from which his stock had sprung, pursued the question. Right in the middle of the Big Burn. Dane, Terra born and bred, realized first what Rip was planning and what it meant. Sealed off was right. The Queen would be amply protected from investigation. Whether her crew would survive was another matter. Whether she could even make a landing there was also to be considered. The Big Burn was the horrible scar left by the last of the atomic wars, a section of radiation-poisoned land comprising hundreds of square miles, land which generations had never dared to penetrate. Originally, the survivors of that war had shunned the whole continent which it disfigured. It had been close to 2 centuries before men had gone into the still, wholesome land lying to the far west and the south, and through the years the avoidance of the Big Burn had become part of their racial instinct as they shrank from it. It was a symbol of something no Terran wanted to remember. But Ali now had only one question to ask. Can we do it? We'll never know until we try, was Rip's reply. The patrol will be watching. That was Weeks. With his Venusian background, he had less respect for the dangers of the Big Burn than he did for the forces of law and order which ranged the star lanes. They'll be watching the route lanes, Rip pointed out. They won't expect a ship to come in on that vector, steering away from the ports. Why would they? As far as I know, it's never been tried since Terraport was laid out. It'll be tricky, and he himself would have to bear most of the responsibility for it, but I believe that it can be done, and we can't just roam around out here. With IS out for our blood and a patrol worn off, it won't do us any good to head for Luna. None of his listeners could argue with that. And Dane's spirit began to rise. After all, they knew so little about the Big Burn. It might afford them just the temporary sanctuary they needed. In the end, they agreed to try it, mainly because none of them could see any alternatives except the too dangerous one of trying to contact the authorities and being summarily treated as a plague ship before they could defend themselves. And their decision was ably endorsed not long afterwards by a sardonic warning on the comm, a warning which Ali, who had been tending the machine, passed along to them. Greetings, pirates. What do you mean? Dane was heating broth to feed to Captain Jellicoe. The word's gone out. Our raid on the Estat is now a matter of history and patrol record. We've been posted. Dane felt a cold finger draw along his backbone. Now they were fair game for the whole system. Any patrol ship that wanted could shoot them down with no questions asked. Of course that had always been a possibility from the first after their raid on the Eastat, but to realize that it was now true was a different matter altogether. This was one occasion when realization was worse than anticipation. He tried to keep his voice level as he answered, "Let us hope we can pull off Rip's plan." "We'd better. What about the Big Burn anyway, Thorson? Is it as tough as the stories say?" "We don't know what it's like. It's never been explored, or at least those who tried to explore its interior never reported in afterwards. As far as I know, it's left strictly alone." "Is it still hot?" "Parts of it must be, but we don't know." With the bottle of soup in his hand, Dane climbed to Jellicoe's cabin, and he was so occupied with the problem at hand that at first he did not see what was happening in the small room. He had braced the captain up into a half-sitting position and was patiently ladling the liquid into his mouth a spoonful at a time when a thin squeak drew his attention to the top of Jellicoe's desk. From the half-open lid of a microtape compartment, something long and dark projected, beating the air feebly. Dane, easing the captain back on the bunk, was going to investigate when the Hoobat broke its unnatural quiet of the past few days with an ear-splitting screech of fury. Dane struck at the bottom of its cage, the move its master always used to silence it, but this time the results were spectacular. The cage bounced up and down on the spring which secured it to the ceiling of the cabin, and the blue-feathered horror slammed against the wires. Either its clawing had weakened them, or some fault had developed, for they parted, and the Hoobat came through them to land with a sullen plop on the desk. Its screams stopped as suddenly as they had begun, and it scuttled on its spider-toed legs to the microtape compartment, acting with purposeful dispatch and paying no attention to Dane. Its claws shot out, and with ease it extracted from the compartment a creature as weird as itself, one which came fighting, and of which Dane could not get a very clear idea. Struggling, they battled across the surface of the desk and flopped to the floor. There, the hunted broke loose from the hunter and fled with fantastic speed into the corridor, and before Dane could move, the Hoobat was after it. He gained the passage just in time to see the Queeks disappear down the ladder, clinging with the aid of its pincer claws, apparently grimly determined to catch up with the thing it pursued, and Dane went after them. There was no sign of the creature who fled on the next level, but Dane made no move to recapture the blue hunter, who squatted at the foot of the ladder, staring unblinkingly into space. Dane waited, afraid to disturb the Hoobat. He had not had a good look at the thing which had run from the Queeks, but he knew it was something which had no business aboard the Queen, and it might be the disturbing factor they were searching for, if the Hoobat would only lead him to it. The Hoobat moved, rearing up on the tips of its 6 legs, its necklace head slowly revolving on its puffy shoulders. Along the ridge of its backbone, its blue feathers were rising into a crest, much as Sinbad's fur rose when the cat was afraid or angry. Then, without any sign of haste, it crawled over and began descending the ladder once more, heading toward the lower section which housed the hydro. Dane remained where he was until it had almost reached the deck of the next level, and then he followed, one step at a time. He was sure that the Hoobat's peculiar construction of body prevented it from looking up unless it turned upon its back, but he did not want to do anything that would alarm it or deter Queeks from what he was sure was a methodical chase. Queeks stopped again, at the foot of the second descent, and sat in its toad stance, apparently brooding, a round blue blot. Dane clung to the ladder and prayed that no one would happen along to frighten it. Then, just as he was beginning to wonder if it had lost contact with its prey, once more it arose, and with the same speed it had displayed in the captain's cabin, it shot along the corridor to the hydro. To Dane's knowledge, the door of the garden was not only shut, but sealed, and how either the stranger or Queeks could get through it he did not see. What the... Ali clattered down the ladder to halt abruptly as Dane waved at him. "Queeks," the cargo apprentice kept his voice to a half-whisper. "It got loose and chased something out of the old man's cabin down here." "Queeks," Ali began, and then shut his mouth, moving noiselessly up to join Dane. The short corridor ended at the hydro entrance, and Dane had been right. There they found the Hoobat crouched at its closed panel, its claws clicking against the metal as it picked away useless at the portal which would not admit it. Whatever it's after must be in there, Dane said softly. And the hydro, stripped of its luxuriance of plant life, occupied now by the tanks of green scum, would not afford too many hiding places. They had only to let Queeks in and keep watch. As they came up, the Hoobat flattened to the floor and shrilled its war cry, spitting at their boots and then flashing claws against the stout metal-enforced hide. However, though it was prepared to fight them, it showed no signs of wishing to retreat, and for that Dane was thankful. He quickly pressed the release and tugged open the panel. At the first crack of its opening, Queeks turned with one of those bursts of astounding speed and clawed for admittance, its protest against the men forgotten, and it squeezed through a space Dane would have thought too narrow to accommodate its bloated body. Both men slipped around the door behind it and closed the panel tight. The air was not as fresh as it had been when the plants were there, and the vats which had taken the places of the banked greenery were certainly nothing to look at. Queeks humped itself into a clod of blue, immovable, halfway down the aisle. Dane tried to subdue his breathing, to listen. The Hoobat's actions certainly argued that the alien thing had taken refuge here, though how it had gotten through? But if it were in the hydro, it was well hidden. He had just begun to wonder how long they must wait when Queeks again went into action. Its clawed front legs upraised, it brought the pincers deliberately together and sawed one across the other, producing a rasping sound, which was almost a vibration in the air. Back and forth moved the claws. Watching them produced an almost hypnotic effect, and the reason for such a maneuver was totally beyond the human watchers, but Queeks knew what it was doing all right. Ali's fingers closed on Dane's arm in a pincher grip, as painful as if he had been equipped with the horny armament of the Hoobat. Something, a flitting shadow, had rounded one vat, and was that much closer to the industrious fiddler on the floor. By some weird magic of its own, the Hoobat was calling its prey to it. Scrape, scrape. The unmusical performance continued with monotonous regularity. Again the shadow flashed, one vat closer. The Hoobat now presented the appearance of one, charmed by its own art, sunk in a lethargy of weird music-making. At last, the enchanted came into full view, though lingering at the round side of a container, very apparently longing to flee again, but under some compulsion to approach its enchanter. Dane blinked, not quite sure that his eyes were not playing tricks on him. He had seen the almost transparent globe boogies of Limbo, had been fascinated by the weird and ugly pictures in Captain Jellicoe's collection of tri-D prints, but this creature was as impossible in its way as the horrific blue thing dragging it out of concealment. It walked erect on two threads of legs with four knobby joints easily detected. A bulging abdomen sheathed in the horny substance of a beetle shell ended in a sharp point. Two pairs of small legs, folded close to the much smaller upper portions of its body, were equipped with thorn-shack terminations. The head, which constantly turned back and forth on the armor-plated shoulders, was long and narrow and split for half its length by a mouth above which were deep pits which must harbor eyes, though actual organs were not visible to the watching men. It was a palish grey in color, which surprised Dane a little. His memory of the few seconds he had seen it on the captain's desk had suggested that it was much darker, and erect as it was, it stood about 18 inches high. With head turning rapidly, it still hesitated by the side of the vat, so nearly the color of the metal that unless it moved it was difficult to distinguish. As far as Dane could see, the Hoobat was paying it no attention. Queeks might be lost in a happy dream, the result of its own fiddling, nor did the rhythm of that scraping vary. The nightmare thing made the last foot in a rush of speed which reduced it to a blur, coming to a halt before the Hoobat. Its front legs whipped out to strike at its enemy, but Queeks was no longer dreaming. This was the moment the Hoobat had been awaiting. One of the sawing claws opened and closed, separating the head of the lurker from its body, and before either of the men could interfere, Queeks had dismembered the prey with dispatch. "Look there," Dane pointed. The Hoobat held close the body of the stranger, and where the ashy corpse came into contact with Queeks's blue-feathered skin, it was slowly changing hue, as if some of the color of its hunter had rubbed off on it. Chameleon! Ali went down on one knee, the better to view the grisly feast now in progress. Watch out, he added sharply as Dane came to join him. One of the thin upper limbs lay where Queeks had discarded it, and from the needle tip was oozing some colorless drops of fluid. Poison? Dane looked around for something which he could use to pick up the still jerking appendage, but before he could find anything, Queeks had appropriated it, and in the end they had to allow the Hoobat its victim in its entirety. But once Queeks had consumed its prey, it lapsed into its usual hunched immobility. Dane went for the cage and working gingerly, he and Ali got the creature back in captivity. But all evidence now left were some smears on the floor of the hydro, smears which Ali blotted up for future research in the lab. An hour later, the four who now comprised the crew of the Queen gathered in the mess for conference. Queeks was in its cage on the table before them, asleep after all its untoward activity. "There must be more than just one," Weeks said, "but how are we going to hunt them down? With Sinbad?" Dane shook his head. Once the Hoobat had been caged and the more prominent evidence of the battle scraped from the floor, he had brought the cat into the hydro and forced him to sniff at the site of the engagement. The result was that Sinbad had gone raving mad, and Dane's hands were now covered with claw tears which ran viciously deep. It was plain that the ship's cat was having none of the intruders, alive or dead. He had fled to Dane's cabin, where he had taken refuge on the bunk, and snarled wild-eye when anyone looked in from the corridor. "Queeks has to do it," Rip said, "but will it hunt unless it's hungry?" He surveyed the now comatose creature skeptically. They had never seen the captain's pet eat anything except some pellets which Jellicoe kept in his desk, and they were aware that the intervals between such feedings were quite lengthy. If they had to wait the usual time for Queeks to feel hunger pangs once more, they might have to wait a long time. "We should catch one alive," Ali remarked thoughtfully. "If we could get Queeks to fiddle it out to where we could net it." Weeks nodded eagerly. "A small net like those the Salariki used. Drop it over the thing." While Queeks still drowsed in its cage, Weeks went to work with a fine cord. Holding the color-changing abilities of the enemy in mind, they could not tell how many of the creatures might be roaming the ship. It could only be proved where they weren't by where Sinbad would consent to stay, so they made plans which included both the cat and the Hoobat. Sinbad, much against his will, was buckled into an improvised harness by which he could be controlled without the handler losing too much valuable skin. And then the hunt started at the top of the ship, proceeding downward section by section. Sinbad raised no protest in the control cabin, nor in the private cabins of the officers thereabouts. If they could interpret his reactions, the center section was free of invaders, so with Dane in control of the cat and Ali carrying the caged Hoobat, they descended once more to the level which housed the hydro galley, steward's quarters, and ship's sick bay. Sinbad proceeded on his own 4 feet into the galley and the mess. He was not uneasy in the sick bay nor in Mora's cabin, and this time he even paced the hydro without being dragged, much to their surprise, as they had thought that the headquarters of the stowaways. Could there have been only one? Weeks wanted to know as he stood by, ready with the net in his hands. "Either that, or else we're wrong about the hydro being their main hideout. If they're afraid of Queeks now, they may have withdrawn to the place they feel safest," Rip said. It was when they were on the ladder leading to the cargo level that Sinbad balked. He planted himself firmly and yowled against further progress until Dane with the harness pulled him along. "Look at Queeks!" They followed the order. The Hoobat was no longer lethargic. It was raising itself, leaning forward to clasp the bars of its cage, and now it uttered one of its screams of rage, and as Ali went on down the ladder, it rattled the bars in a determined effort for freedom. Sinbad, spitting and yowling, refused to walk. Rip nodded to Ali. "Let it out." Tipped out of its cage, the Hoobat scuttled forward straight for the panel which opened on the large cargo space, and there waited, as if for them to open the portal and admit the hunter to its hunting territory. Chapter 13. Off the Map. Across the lock of the panel was the seal set in place by Van Rieke before the spacer had lifted from Sargol. Under Dane's inspection it showed no crack. To all evidence the hatch had not been opened since they left the perfumed planet, and yet the hunting Hubbat was sure that the invading pests were within. It took only a second for Dane to commit an act which, if he could not defend it later, would blacklist him out of space. He twisted off the official seal which should remain there while the freighter was spaceborne. With Ollie's help, he shouldered aside the heavy sliding panel, and they looked into the cargo space, now filled with the red wood from Sargol. The red wood. When he saw it, Dane was struck with their stupidity. Aside from the Koro stones in the stone box, only the wood had come from the Salariki world. What if the pests had not been planted by IS agents, but were natives of Sargol being brought in with the wood? The men remained at the hatch to allow the Hubbat freedom in its hunt, and Sinbad crouched behind them, snarling and giving voice to a rumbling growl which was his negative opinion of the proceedings. They were conscious of an odor, the sharp, unidentifiable scent Dane had noticed during the loading of the wood. It was not unpleasant, merely different, and it or something had an electrifying effect upon Queeks. The blue hunter climbed with the aid of its claws to the top of the nearest pile of wood, and there settled down. For a space it was apparently contemplating the area about it. Then it raised its claws and began the scraping fiddle which once before had drawn its prey out of hiding. Oddly enough, that dry rasp of sound had a quieting effect upon Sinbad, and Dane felt the drag of the harness lessen as the cat moved, not toward escape, but to the scene of action, humping himself at last in the open panel, his round eyes fixed upon the Hubbat with a fascinated stare. Scrape, scrape. The monotonous noise bit into the ears of the men, gnawed at their nerves. Ah! Ali kept his voice to a whisper, but his hand jerked to draw their attention to the right at deck level. Dane saw that flicker along a log. The stowaway pest was now the same brilliant color as the wood, indistinguishable until it moved, which probably explained how it had come on board. But that was only the first arrival. A second flash of movement and a third followed. Then the hunted remained stationary, able to resist for a period the insidious summoning of Queeks. The Hubbat maintained an attitude of indifference, of being so wrapped in its music that nothing else existed. Rip whispered to Weeks, "There's one to the left, on the very end of that log. Can you net it?" The small oiler slipped the coiled mesh through his calloused hands. He edged around Ali, keeping his eyes on the protruding bump of red upon red which was his quarry. 2, 3, 4, 5. Ali was counting under his breath, but Dane could not see that many. He was sure of only 4, and those because he had seen them move. The things were ringing in the pile of wood where the Hubbat fiddled, and 2 had ascended the first logs toward their doom. Weeks went down on one knee, ready to cast his net, when Dane had his first inspiration. He drew his sleep rod, easing it out of its holster, set the lever on spray, and beamed it at 3 of those humps. Rip, seeing what he was doing, dropped a hand on Weeks' shoulder, holding the oiler in check. A hump moved, slid down the rounded side of the log into the narrow aisle of deck between 2 piles of wood. It lay quiet, a bright scarlet blot against the gray. Then Weeks did move, throwing his net over it and jerking the drawstring tight, at the same time pulling the captive toward him over the deck. But even as it came, the scarlet of the thing's body was fading to an ashy pink, and at last taking on a gray as dull as the metal on which it lay, the complete camouflage. Had they not had it enmeshed, they might have lost it altogether, so well did it now blend with the surface. The other 2 in the path of the ray had not lost their grip upon the logs, and the men could not advance to scoop them up. Not while there were others not affected, free to flee back into hiding. Weeks bound the net about the captive and looked to Rip for orders. "Deep freeze," the acting commander of the Queen said succinctly. "Let me see it get out of that." Surely, the cold of deep freeze united to the sleep ray would keep the creature under control until they had a chance to study it. But as Weeks passed Sinbad on his errand, the cat was so frantic to avoid him that he reared up on his hind legs, almost turning a somersault, snarling and spitting until Weeks was up the ladder to the next level. It was very evident that the ship's cat was having none of this pest. They might have been invisible and their actions non-existent as far as Queeks was concerned, for the Hoobat continued its siren concert. The lured became more reckless, mounting the logs to Queeks's post in sudden darts. Dane wondered how the Hoobat proposed handling 4 of the creatures at once, for although the other 2 which had been in the path of the ray had not moved, he now counted 4 climbing. "Stand by to ray." That was Rip. But it would have been interesting to see how Queeks was prepared to handle the 4. And though Rip had given the order to stand by, he had not ordered the ray to be used. Was he, too, interested in that? The first red projection was within a foot of the Hoobat now, and its fellows had frozen as if to allow it the honor of battle with the feathered enemy. To all appearances, Queeks did not see it, but when it sprang with a whir of speed which would baffle a human, the Hoobat was ready, and its claws, halting their rasp, met around the wasp-thin waist of the pest, speedily cutting it in 2. Only this time the Hoobat made no move to unjoint and consume the victim. Instead, it squatted in utter silence, as motionless as a 3D print. The heavy, lower half of the creature rolled down the pile of logs to the deck, and there paled to the gray of its background. None of its kind appeared to be interested in its fate. The 2 which had been in the path of the ray continued to be humps on the wood, the others faced the Hoobat. But Rip was ready to waste no more time. "Ray them," he snapped. All 3 of their sleep rods sprayed the pile, catching in passing the Hoobat. Queeks's pop eyes closed, but it showed no other sign of falling under the spell of the beam. Certain that all the creatures in sight were now relatively harmless, the 3 approached the logs, but it was necessary to get into touching distance before they could even make out the outlines of the nightmare things, so well did their protective coloring conceal them. Wearing gloves, Ali detached the little monsters from their holds in the wood and put them for temporary safekeeping during a transfer to the deep freeze into the Hoobat's cage. Queeks they decided to leave where it was for a space, to awaken and trap any survivor which had been too wary to emerge at the first siren song. As far as they could tell, the Hoobat was their only possible protection against the pest, and to leave it in the center of the infection was the wisest course. Having dumped the now metal-colored catch into the freeze, they held a conference. "No plague," Weeks breathed a sigh of relief. "No proof of that yet," Ali cut him up short. "We have to prove it past any reasonable doubt." "And how are we gonna—" Dane began when he saw what the other had brought in from Tao's stores. A lancet, and the upper half of the creature Queeks had killed in the cargo hold. The needle-pointed front feet of the thing were curled up in its death throes, and it was now a dirty white shade, as if the ability to change color had been lost before it matched the cotton on which it lay. With the lancet, Ali forced a claw away from the body. It was oozing the watery liquid which they had seen on the one in the hydro. "I have an idea," he said slowly, his eyes on the mangled creature rather than on his shipmates, "that we might have escaped being attacked because they sheared off from us. But if we were clawed, we might take it too. Remember, those marks on the throats and the backs of the rest? That might be the entry point of this poison, if poison it is." Dane could see the end of that line of reasoning. Rip and Ali, they couldn't be spared. The knowledge they had would bring the Queen to Earth, but a cargo master was excess baggage when there was no reason for trade. It was his place to try out the truth of Ali's surmise. But while he thought, another acted. Weeks leaned over and twitched the lancet out of Ali's fingers. Then, before any of them could move, he thrust its contaminated point into the back of his hand. "Don't!" Both Dane's cry and Rip's hand came too late. It had been done, and Weeks sat there looking alone and frightened, studying the drop of blood which marked the dig of the surgeon's keen knife. But when he spoke, his voice sounded perfectly natural. "Headache first, isn't it?" Only Ali was outwardly unaffected by what the little man had just done. "Just be sure you have a real one," he warned with what Dane privately considered real callousness. Weeks nodded. "Don't let my imagination work," he answered shrewdly. "I know. It has to be real. How long do you suppose? We don't know. Rip sounded tired, beaten. Meanwhile, he got to his feet. We'd better set a course home. Home, Weeks repeated. To him, Terra was not his own home. He had been born in the polar swamps of Venus, but to all Solarians, no matter which planet had nurtured them, Terra was home. You. Rip's big hand fell gently on the little oiler's shoulder. Stay here with Thorson. No, Weeks shook his head. Unless I black out, I'm riding station in the engine room. Maybe the bug won't work on me anyway. And because he had done what he had done, they could not deny him the right to ride his station as long as he could during the grueling hours to come. Dane visited the cargo hold once more, to be greeted by an irate scream which assured him that Queeks was again awake and on guard. Although the Hoobat was ready enough to give tongue, it still squatted in its chosen position on top of the log stack, and he did not try to dislodge it. Perhaps with Queeks planted in the enemy's territory, they would have nothing to fear from any pests not now confined in the deep freeze. Rip set his course for Terra, for that plague spot on their native world where they might hide out the Queen until they could prove their point that the Spacer was not a disease-ridden ship to be feared. He kept to the control cabin, shifting only between the astrogators and the pilot's station. Upon him alone rested the responsibility of bringing in the ship along a vector which crossed no well-traveled space lane where the patrol might challenge them. Dane rode out the orbiting in the Comtech seat, listening in for the first warning sign of danger that they had been detected. The mechanical repetition of their list of crimes was now stale news and largely off-ether, and from all traces he could pick up, they were lost as far as the authorities were concerned. On the other hand, the patrol might indeed be as far-knowing as its propaganda stated, and the Queen was running headlong into a trap. Only they had no choice in... Excuse me. Only they had no choice in the matter. It was the ship's intercom bringing Ali's voice from the engine room which broke the concentration in the control cabin. Weeks down. Rip barked into the mic. How bad? He hasn't blacked out yet. The pains in his head are pretty bad and his hand is swelling. He's given us our proof. Tell him to report off. But the disembodied voice which answered that was Weeks. I haven't got it as bad as the others. I'll ride this out. Rip shook his head, but short-handed as they were, he could not argue Weeks away from his post if the man insisted upon staying. He had other, and for the time being, more important matters before him. How long they sweated out that descent upon their native world, Dane could never afterwards have testified. He only knew that hours must have passed until he thought groggily that he could not remember a time he was not glued in the seat which had been Tang's, the earphones pressing against his sweating skull, his fatigue-drugged mind being held with difficulty to the duty at hand. Sometime during that haze they made their landing. He had a dim memory of Rip sprawled across the pilot's control board, and then utter exhaustion claimed him also, and the darkness closed in. When he roused, it was to look about a cabin tilted to one side. Rip was still slumped in a muscle-cramping posture, breathing heavily. Dane bit out a forceful word born of twinges of his own, and then snapped on the visa plate. For a long moment he was sure that he was not yet awake, and then, as his dazed mind supplied names for what he saw, he knew that Rip had failed. Far from being in the center, or at least well within the perimeter of the dread Big Burn, they must have landed in some civic park or national forest. For the massed green outside, the bright flowers, the bird he sighted as a brilliant flash of wind-coasting color, those were not to be found in the twisted horror left by man's last attempt to impress his will upon his resisting kind. Well, it had been a good try, but there was no use expecting luck to ride their fins all the way, and they had more than their share in the Eastat affair. How long would it be before the law arrived to collect them? Would they have time to state their case? The faint hope that they might aroused him. He reached for the comm key, and a second later tore the headphones from his appalled ears. The crackle of static he knew, and the numerous strange noises which broke in upon the lanes of communication in space, but this solid, paralyzing roar was something totally new. New and frightening, and because it was new, he could not account for it. He turned back to regard the scene on the viewer with a more critical eye. The foliage which grew in riotous profusion, was green right enough, and Terra green into the bargain. There was no mistaking that, but Dane caught at the edge of the comm unit for support. But what was that liver-red blossom which had just reached out to engulf a small flying thing? Feverishly, he tried to remember the little natural history he knew. Sure that what he had just witnessed was unnatural, un-Terran, and to be suspect, he started the spy lens on its slow revolution in the Queen's nose to get a full picture of their immediate surroundings. It was tilted at an angle. Apparently they had not made a fin-point landing this time, and sometimes it merely reflected slices of sky, but when it swept earthward, he saw enough to make him believe that wherever the spacer had set down, it was not on the Terra he knew. Subconsciously, he'd expected the Big Burn to be barren land, curdled rock with rivers of frozen quartz substances boiled up through the crust of the planet by the action of the atomic explosives. That was the way it had been on Limbo. On the other burned-off worlds they had discovered were those who had preceded mankind into the galaxy. The mysterious, long-vanished forerunners had fought their grim and totally annihilating wars. But it would seem that the Big Burn was altogether different, at least here it was. There was no rock sterile of life outside. In fact, there would appear to be too much life. What Dane could sight on his limited field of vision was a teeming jungle. And the thrill of that discovery almost made him forget their present circumstances. He was still staring bemused at the screen when Rip muttered, turned his head on folded arms, and opened his sunken eyes. "Did we make it?" he asked dully. Dane, not taking his eyes from that fascinating scene without, answered, "You brought us down, but I don't know where. Unless our instruments were way off, we're near to the heart of the burn." "Some heart. What does it look like?" Rip sounded too tired to cross the cabin and see for himself. "Barren as Limbo?" "Hardly. Rip, did you ever see a tomato as big as a melon? At least it looks like a tomato." Dane halted the spy lens as it focused upon this new phenomena. "A what?" There was a note of concern in Shannon's voice. "What's the matter with you, Dane?" "Come and see." Dane willingly yielded his place to Rip, but he did not step out of range of the screen. Surely that did have the likeness to a good, old-fashioned, Earth-sized tomato, but it was melon-size, and it hung from a bush which was close to a 10-foot tree. Rip stumbled across to drop into the Comtex place, but his expression of worry changed to one of simple astonishment as he saw the picture. Where are we? You name it. Dane had had longer to adjust, the excitement of an explorer sighting virgin territory working in his veins, banishing fatigue. It must be the Big Burn. But Rip shook his head slowly, as if with that gesture to deny the evidence before his eyes. "That country's all bare rock. I've seen pictures." "Of the outer rim," Dane corrected, having already solved the problem for himself. "This must be further in than any survey ship ever came. Great spirit of outer space, what has happened here?" Rip had enough technical training to know how to get part of the answer. He leaned halfway across the comm and was able to flick down a lever with the very tip of his longest finger. Instantly, the cabin was filled with a clicking so loud as to make an almost continuous drone of sound. Dane knew that danger signal. He didn't need Rip's words to underline it for him. "Well, that's what's happened. This country is pile hot out there." And I think that is a really good place for us to leave off, with the radioactive jungle outside, chameleon, poison, bug things inside, and a little bit of progress on figuring out the mystery. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. I hope you'll join me on Thursday as we continue Plague Ship by Andre Norton. And I hope you have a good rest of your night, good Easter, and a good weekend. Good night.